In 1996, General Motors built an electric car so advanced that the engineers who drove it said it felt like the future had already arrived. 0 to 60 in under 8 seconds. Silent, smooth. No gas, no oil changes, no exhaust. The drivers loved it. The engineers were proud of it. And then, without warning, GM took every single one back and crushed them. Not recycled them, not stored them. Crushed them into cubes of metal and sent them to a landfill. Every single one. Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to AUTOSAYS. If that already hit you somewhere uncomfortable, stay with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes, because it gets a lot stranger before it makes sense. The car was called the EV1, and the story of how it was born, how it thrived, and how it was systematically erased is one of the most debated, most controversial chapters in the entire history of the automobile industry. Not just because of what happened, but because of why. And depending on who you ask, you'll get a completely different answer. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. It's 1987. A race is happening in the Australian desert under a scorching sun, the World Solar Challenge. Teams from universities and corporations around the world are competing to build the fastest solar-powered vehicle over a 1,800-mile course. GM enters a car called the Sun Racer. It doesn't just win. It finishes so far ahead of the competition that the second-place car arrives almost 2 days later. GM's engineers have just proven something. When you take the combustion engine out of a car and replace it with electric power, the result can be genuinely extraordinary. The aerodynamics become cleaner, the weight distribution changes, the performance numbers surprise everyone, including the team that built it, and one man in the crowd watches the Sun Racer cross the finish line and decides he has to build a production version for regular people. His name was Paul McCready, the same aeronautical engineer who had designed the Sun Racer. And when he brought the idea back to GM, the executives didn't laugh at him. They funded him. Fully. Because in the late 1980s, GM was not a company that ignored innovation. They were a company that was genuinely worried about losing the future. Here's where the context matters. In California, the Air Resources Board was preparing one of the most aggressive environmental regulations in automotive history. The zero-emission vehicle mandate, a law that would require any automaker selling more than a certain number of cars in California to make a percentage of those cars produce zero emissions. Not low emissions, zero. If you wanted to sell cars in California, the largest auto market in the United States, you had to play by these new rules. And GM, to their credit, didn't fight it immediately. They built a car. The EV1 launched in 1996, and it was unlike anything on American roads. It had a drag coefficient lower than almost any production car in history, meaning it slipped through air with almost no resistance. The battery pack, originally lead acid and later upgraded to nickel metal hydride, gave it a real-world range of roughly 75 to 160 miles, depending on the version. The interior was clean and futuristic. The drivetrain had almost no moving parts, compared to a gasoline engine, which meant almost nothing to break down or maintain. GM leased it. They never sold it outright, which is a detail we're going to come back to. In California and Arizona, to selected drivers who went through an application process to get behind the wheel. And here's the thing, almost nobody talks about. The waiting list was enormous. People wanted this car. Not in the way people say they want something in a survey, in the way people show up to dealerships and beg to be put on a list, in the way drivers who already had an EV1 lease wrote letters to GM pleading to extend it. One EV1 driver, an actress named Alexandra Paul, later recalled that she cried at the GM lot when they came to take her car away. She didn't just love the car, she said it had changed the way she thought about driving entirely. Now, you'd think at this point, the story would pivot toward triumph. Demand exists, the technology works, the regulations are pushing the industry forward. GM has a head start that competitors would have killed for. Instead, something shifted. Beginning around 1999, GM started pulling back. Not dramatically at first, quietly. The marketing budget for the EV1 shrank. The leases stopped being renewed. New applicants found it harder to get approved. And then, in 2002 and 2003, GM began the process of recalling every EV1 that existed. Drivers were told their leases were expiring and would not be renewed. Offers of purchase, even when lessees offered to buy the cars outright, were refused. The cars were repossessed. And then they were crushed. The official explanation from GM was simple. The economics didn't work. The cars were expensive to produce, expensive to support, and the market, in GM's assessment, wasn't large enough to justify continuing. They pointed out that despite the waiting list, the EV1 had never turned a profit. Each car cost somewhere between $35,000 and $80,000 to produce, but was leased for far less. The battery technology of the era had real limitations. Range anxiety was a genuine consumer concern, and the zero-emission vehicle mandate from California had been weakened through a series of legal challenges, some brought by the automakers themselves, which meant the regulatory pressure that had originally justified the program had loosened. But here's where it gets strange. Because at the exact same time, GM was crushing the EV1, a battery technology company called Ovonic was developing the nickel metal hydride battery pack that had been used in the later EV1 models. A battery that could potentially double or triple the range. And in 2001, the patent rights to that battery technology were quietly acquired by a company called Texaco. And then, Texaco was acquired by Chevron, one of the largest oil companies on Earth. And those patents were then licensed in ways that critics argued prevented their use in large format electric vehicle batteries. Now, whether that was a deliberate conspiracy to kill the electric car, or a series of coincidental business decisions, that is a question that has been argued loudly for 20 years. The 2006 documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, laid out the case for the conspiracy theory in detail. GM pushed back. Industry analysts pushed back. The real answer is probably somewhere in between, more boring and more systemic than a single villain in a boardroom, but more deliberate than pure accident. What is not in dispute is this. In a landfill in Arizona, the physical remains of the most advanced electric cars ever built by an American automaker were buried. A handful of EV1 survived. GM donated a small number to museums, but only after removing and destroying their drivetrains so they could never be driven again. Let that sink in for a moment. They didn't just take the cars, they made sure the cars could never run. As if the idea itself needed to be made impossible. The financial dimension of this story is worth sitting with. In 2003, when GM killed the EV1 program entirely, Tesla did not yet exist as a car company. The first Tesla Roadster would not be delivered until 2008. If GM had continued developing EV technology, even slowly, even cautiously, they would have owned a 5-year head start in a market that eventually became worth trillions of dollars. The market capitalization of Tesla today dwarfs General Motors by a factor that would have been genuinely unthinkable to any analyst in 2003. GM missed not just a product, they missed a category. And there is a real argument that the EV1's death was not just a missed opportunity, it was a self-inflicted wound. GM spent the early 2000s lobbying against the very regulations that had forced them to innovate. They won those lobbying battles, and in winning them, they removed the pressure that was making them better. By 2009, the company that built the EV1 filed for bankruptcy. The government spent $50 billion to keep it alive. And by that point, the future it had once held in its hands had already been handed to someone else. There is one final thread in this story that I think matters, more than all the rest. The people who drove the EV1 didn't just like their cars. Many of them described a psychological shift, a feeling that once you had experienced driving without noise, without vibration, without a monthly stop at the gas station, you couldn't go back to thinking about cars the same way. The product had already changed how people felt. The demand was already forming, and GM had the data. They had the drivers. They had the engineers who believed in it. They chose to walk away anyway. Whether that was a rational business decision, regulatory capture by the oil industry, short-sighted, executive thinking, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. The best electric car in the world was buried in a desert, and the industry that built it spent the next decade pretending electric vehicles weren't viable, right up until the moment a startup in California proved that they were. Here's what I want to leave you with. The EV1 didn't fail because drivers didn't want it. It failed because the people who owned it were afraid of what it would do to everything else they sold. That's not a story about technology. That's a story about power, and who gets to decide what the future looks like. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If GM had kept the EV1 alive, do you think Tesla would even exist? Think carefully before you answer, because I think you might surprise yourself. And if this story made you feel something, wait until you hear what happened to the one electric car that survived, and what the engineers who built the EV1 did next. That story is coming. Don't miss it.